The deaf Apache girl heard the lonely rancher long before the town ever did. The old boards beneath Ayana's boots trembled softly in the cold night air, and she stopped walking at once. Snow drifted across the empty street in thin silver lines while lantern light flickered weak against the windows of the trading post. Around her, the town of Black Hollow carried on in silence. But to Ayana, silence was never truly empty. She felt things other people ignored. Vibrations through wood, breathing through walls, fear hidden beneath footsteps. And right now, somewhere beyond the frozen wind, someone was hurting. Ayana slowly turned her head toward the northern ridge where the lonely ranch sat alone against the dark Wyoming hills. Most people avoided that place after sunset. They said Elias Boone had gone strange years ago. Said grief hollowed him out until he stopped speaking unless absolutely necessary. Some claimed he talked to horses more than people. Others swore they'd heard harmonica music drifting through the valley at midnight, even though no one had seen him inside town in months. Ayana pulled her worn Apache blanket tighter around her shoulders and stepped carefully across the icy road. Her moccasins made almost no sound. The wooden buildings around her groaned beneath the winter wind while a pair of drunk miners laughed somewhere behind the saloon doors, but she ignored them. She always ignored them. Men in towns like this looked at Apache people the way hunters looked at wolves near cattle. Suspicious, nervous, ready to blame them for every missing coin, every broken fence, every bad season. And being deaf only made their stares linger longer. They thought she was broken, simple-minded, cursed. Earlier that evening, a woman at the general store had spoken directly to Ayana's uncle instead of her, asking loudly if the poor girl understood civilized words. Ayana understood perfectly. She just chose not to answer. The cold deepened as she left the town behind and followed the narrow dirt trail toward the ridge. Dry snow crunched beneath her feet, while pine trees swayed overhead like dark giants whispering to each other. Then she felt it again. A faint vibration. Slow, uneven. Not thunder. Not hoofbeats. Music. Her eyes lifted toward the lonely ranch in the distance. A single lantern burned near the barn, glowing weak against the black prairie night. Elias Boone sat alone on the porch steps beside that lantern, shoulders heavy beneath a thick wool coat, harmonica pressed against his mouth. The melody moved low and slow through the frozen air like smoke drifting from a dying fire. Sad enough to make the stars seem colder. Elias didn't notice her at first. Most people didn't. Ayana moved quietly, and Elias Boone had spent too many years carrying memories heavier than the world around him. He stared out across the open land while he played, his weathered hands rough against the small silver instrument. The ranch around him looked tired. Fence posts leaned sideways under old snow. The barn roof sagged near one corner. Wind pushed loose shutters against the walls with soft, hollow knocks. Nothing about the place looked alive except the old rancher sitting beneath the lantern glow. Ayana stopped near the porch and lowered one hand to the wooden railing. The harmonica's vibrations traveled through the wood into her fingertips. Her eyes widened slightly. She couldn't hear the notes the way others could, but she could feel them. Every rise, every ache, every lonely pause between breaths. Elias finally noticed movement near the gate and stiffened immediately. His hand lowered from the harmonica, while his sharp gray eyes locked onto the figures standing in the snow. For a long moment, neither moved. The wind carried dust and ice between them. Then Elias spoke quietly. "Town's 5 miles south." His voice sounded rough from disuse. Ayana stepped closer instead of leaving. Lantern light touched her face now, revealing dark braids dusted with snow and calm brown eyes that studied him without fear. Elias frowned slightly. Most folks avoided eye contact with him. This Apache girl didn't. She rested her fingertips against the porch rail again, feeling the fading tremor from the harmonica. Then she spoke softly. "That song hurts." Elias froze. The words hit him harder than they should have. His jaw tightened while cold. Wind swept across the porch. "You hear music?" he asked after a moment. Ayana shook her head gently. "Not with ears." She lifted her hand from the wood. "With this." Elias stared at her fingers for several quiet seconds. He looked like a man trying to remember something he buried years ago. Behind him, the barn doors creaked softly while horses shifted inside their stalls. One of them stomped nervously against the floorboards. Elias glanced toward the sound automatically. "Storm's coming," he muttered. Ayana looked toward the dark horizon where heavy clouds rolled slowly over the mountains. The air already smelled like snow and cedar smoke. Somewhere far off, a wolf howled into the night. Elias stood slowly from the porch steps, his knees stiff from years of ranch work and colder winters than any man deserved. You shouldn't be out here alone. Ayana's expression changed just slightly at those words. Not sadness exactly. Recognition. People often said she shouldn't be alone. But loneliness and solitude weren't always the same thing. She studied Elias carefully now. The tired eyes. The old grief hiding behind them. The way his shoulders remained tense even standing still. Then her gaze drifted past him through the ranch house window, where something small sat on a dusty shelf near the fire. A pair of tiny leather boots. Child-sized. Worn with age. Elias noticed her looking and immediately stepped sideways, blocking the window from view. The movement was quick enough to surprise even him. Ayana lowered her eyes politely, but the damage was already done. The lonely rancher had a ghost inside that house. And somehow, she could already feel it breathing. The wind grew sharper after midnight, sliding across the Wyoming plains hard enough to rattle the loose tin above the barn. Elias Boone stood near the porch rail watching dark clouds gather over the mountains while the Apache girl remained still beside the lantern glow, her fingers resting lightly against the weathered wood beneath her palm. Most people filled silence with nervous words. She did not. Somehow that unsettled him more than noise ever could. The horses shifted again inside the barn, restless from the pressure in the air. Elias reached for the lantern hanging beside the door and muttered quietly, "Storm will hit within the hour." Ayana watched his mouth carefully when he spoke, not reading every word exactly, feeling them, the rhythm, the shape. She nodded once. Snowflakes drifted between them now, slow at first, almost gentle. Elias glanced toward the trail leading back to town. The wind had already begun erasing footprints. "You got family waiting?" he asked. Ayana hesitated before answering. "My uncle trades supplies at the South Camp. He thinks I stayed with women near the church." Elias grunted softly. "And did you?" A faint smile touched her face for the first time. Small, brief, gone almost immediately. No, something about that answer almost sounded like honesty wrapped inside mischief. And Elias found himself looking at her a second longer than intended. She could not have been more than 20 years old, yet her eyes carried the stillness of somebody much older. No fear, no performance, just observation. The kind that made a man feel seen even when he wished to remain invisible. Elias opened the ranch house door, and warm firelight spilled across the porch boards. "Come inside till the storm passes." Ayana looked surprised. So did Elias. The invitation had escaped before he could stop it. He had not welcomed anyone into that house in nearly 11 years. Not since the winter sickness took his wife Clara and their daughter Rose within 6 days of each other. Folks in Black Hollow stopped visiting after the funerals. At first out of respect, later out of discomfort. Grief frightened people when it lasted too long. And Elias Boone carried his like a second shadow. Ayana stepped carefully inside while Elias hung the lantern near the doorway. The ranch house smelled of cedar smoke, leather, and old coffee. Everything inside looked worn but cared for. Boots lined neatly beside the wall. Firewood stacked with perfect balance. A faded blue quilt folded carefully across the couch. The room held the quiet discipline of a man surviving one day at a time without ever saying so aloud. Ayana slowly removed her blanket and held her hands near the fire. Her fingers trembled slightly from the cold. Elias noticed immediately. He moved toward the stove and poured hot water from a kettle into a chipped tin cup. Then he paused halfway. Hospitality felt unfamiliar now, rusted from disuse. "Tea," he said awkwardly, setting the cup near her. "Only thing I got besides whiskey." Ayana accepted it with both hands. Steam curled softly against her face. "Thank you." Elias sat heavily in the chair near the fireplace, though his eyes never fully left her. Outside, the storm strengthened. Wind slammed against the walls while snow hissed across the windows. Somewhere in the distance came the low groan of shifting trees under ice. Ayana lowered herself onto the edge of the couch, but her attention drifted again toward the small pair of child-sized boots resting near the fireplace shelf. Up close, she could see tiny flower stitching along the leather edges. Handmade. Loved once. Elias noticed where she looked. His jaw tightened immediately. "Do not," he said quietly. The words carried no anger, just pain sharpened by habit. Ayanna lowered her eyes respectfully. I am sorry. Silence returned, heavy this time. Elias rubbed one rough hand across his face while firelight flickered against the deep lines near his eyes. He looked exhausted in ways sleep could never fix. Finally, he spoke again without looking at her. Most folks around here think quiet means empty. Ayanna lifted her gaze slowly. Elias stared into the fire. Truth is, quiet can be loud enough to drive a man crazy. The wind outside screamed across the roof just then, as if proving his point. Ayanna rested her fingertips lightly against the wooden couch frame beneath her, feeling, listening in her own way. My grandmother used to say silence shows you things noise hides. Elias gave a faint, humorless laugh. Your grandmother sounds smarter than most preachers. Ayanna smiled slightly again, this one softer than before. Then her expression changed as another vibration moved through the floorboards beneath her feet. Different this time. Not wind, not horses. Her eyes narrowed toward the far side of the ranch house. Elias noticed instantly. What is it? She stood slowly. Someone is outside. Elias frowned. No, he listened carefully. Nothing except the storm. Could be tree branches. But Ayanna was already moving toward the front window, her face tense now. She touched the wall lightly with her fingertips. Then the floor. Elias rose from his chair, instincts sharpening beneath years of isolation. The rancher crossed toward the rifle hanging near the door, though he did not lift it yet. You sure? Ayanna nodded once. Calm. Certain. 2 horses. Elias stared at her for one long second before stepping toward the window. At first he saw only blowing snow and darkness swallowing the trail. Then lightning flashed far off beyond the ridge. 2 riders stood motionless near the fence line, half hidden inside the storm. The 2 riders remained perfectly still beyond the fence line, while snow whipped across the ranch in pale waves beneath the moonlight. Elias Boone narrowed his eyes toward the storm, one rough hand resting near the rifle hanging beside the front door. The lantern inside the house flickered softly behind him, casting long shadows across the floorboards while Ayanna stood near the window without moving. She could feel the faint tremor of the horses through the wood beneath her feet. Slow shifting weight. Leather creaking. Men waiting. Elias finally opened the front door, and freezing wind rushed into the house hard enough to make the fire snap behind him. Stay inside, he muttered. Ayanna watched him step onto the porch, his boots crunching against fresh snow while the old ranch coat pulled tight around his broad shoulders. The storm made him look older somehow, like part of the land itself, worn down by weather and silence, but still standing. The riders did not move as Elias approached the fence. Snow drifted between them in silver sheets until lightning flashed far out near the mountains again, briefly illuminating their faces. Apache men, one older, one young. Neither carried weapons in hand. Elias stopped 20 feet away. Little late for visitors, he called out calmly. The older rider inclined his head slightly. We came for the girl. Elias glanced back once toward the house window where Ayanna stood watching. From the firelight. Her uncle, then. The older Apache man looked weathered and stern beneath the snow collecting on his shoulders. His dark braid hung heavy against a thick buffalo coat, while his eyes remained fixed on the ranch house behind Elias. Storm closed the southern trail, Elias said. She stayed warm here. The younger rider shifted uneasily in his saddle at those words. Not hostile. Nervous. Elias noticed immediately. Something wrong. The older man hesitated before answering. A boy from town disappeared before sunset. Wind swept hard across the pasture. Elias felt the tension settle into his chest at once. In places like Black Hollow, trouble always searched for someone easy to blame. Apache camps sat highest on that list. How old? Elias asked quietly. Maybe 8 years. The younger rider finally spoke. His mother says he wandered near the river. Elias looked back toward the dark valley where the frozen river cut through the pines north of town. Dangerous even without a storm. Town blaming your people already? The older Apache man gave a tired look that answered the question before words arrived. They say our camp stole him. Elias exhaled slowly through his nose. Same story every winter. Fear turned ordinary folks cruel faster than hunger ever could. Then the older man looked past him toward the house again. Ayanna should return before sunrise. Elias frowned slightly. Why? The younger rider answered this time, his voice low. Men in town are drinking tonight. That told Elias everything he needed to know. Ayanna was safer here than riding through Black Hollow during a storm, while frightened men searched for someone to blame. He glanced toward the dark trail leading into town and saw distant lanterns moving far off through the snow. More than one. Horses. His expression hardened immediately. The older Apache rider followed his gaze. Too late, he murmured. Elias stepped backward toward the porch slowly without taking his eyes off the approaching lights. Get your horses behind the barn. The younger rider looked startled. You would hide us? Elias gave a dry, humorless smile. I would avoid stupidity if possible. The older Apache man nodded once without argument. Both riders guided their horses silently toward the rear of the ranch while Elias returned to the porch. Inside, Ayanna already stood near the fire wrapping her blanket tightly around her shoulders. She had seen his face, seen the change in it. The missing boy, she said softly. Elias looked at her sharply. How did you know? She touched 2 fingers lightly against the floorboards. Fear feels different than weather. Elias stared at her for a second before glancing back outside. The lanterns were closer now. For riders at least. Maybe 5. Town men. The rancher shut the door carefully and lowered the wooden bar into place. The sound echoed through the quiet house. You stay away from the windows. Ayanna stepped closer instead. They think my people took the child. They think lots of things. Elias reached for the old coffee pot near the stove, more out of habit than thirst. Most of them wrong. Outside, horses approached the ranch fence at a hard pace before slowing suddenly near the house. Lantern light flashed across the windows. Then came a voice through the storm. Boone. Elias closed his eyes briefly at the sound. Deputy Warren Pike. Young. Nervous. Too eager to prove himself useful. Open up. Elias did not move immediately. The room felt smaller suddenly. Fire snapping softly. Wind pushing against the walls. Ayanna stood very still beside the table, calm in ways most hearing people never managed. Finally, Elias opened the door halfway, without removing the wooden bar completely. Snow swirled across the porch around Deputy Pike and 3 other townsmen on horseback. Their coats were dusted white, and their faces tight with cold and tension. Pike leaned forward in the saddle. We are looking for a missing boy. Elias nodded once. Heard. Pike's eyes shifted past him into the house. Folks say Apache traders were near town before sunset. Elias stared at him without expression. Apache traders are near town every winter. One of the men behind Pike muttered something ugly beneath his breath. Elias ignored it. Pike shifted uncomfortably before speaking again. You seen anything unusual? Elias thought of Ayanna, standing quietly behind him. Thought of the fear already spreading through Black Hollow. Thought of what frightened men did when storms trapped them with their own anger. Then he answered slowly. Only thing unusual tonight is grown men chasing shadows while a storm freezes the valley solid. Pike's jaw tightened. The deputy was young enough to still believe authority sounded stronger when spoken loudly. If the child turns up harmed, Elias cut him off with one cold look. Not anger. Worse. Disappointment. Then maybe spend less time blaming strangers and more time finding him. Silence hung there for a long moment beneath the howl of winter wind. Finally, Pike pulled his horse around sharply. We will search north of the river. Elias nodded once. That is where I would start. The riders disappeared slowly into the snowstorm, lanterns fading between the trees until darkness swallowed them completely. Elias shut the door again and rested one hand against the old wood for a long second. Behind him, Ayanna spoke softly into the quiet room. The boy is still alive. Elias turned toward her. How do you know? She looked toward the frozen north window where snow drifted against the glass. Her expression changed slightly then. Distant. Listening to something no one else could hear. Because somebody out there is still calling for him. And if you have made it this far into the storm beside Elias and Ayanna, leave a comment and like the video so I know you are still riding with this story through the Wyoming night. The storm swallowed the ranch by midnight. Snow piled against the porch steps in thick white drifts while freezing wind hissed through cracks in the old barn walls like something alive wandering outside in the dark. Inside the house, the fire burned lower now, casting deep orange light across the floorboards where shadows stretched long and thin. Elias Boone sat near the window sharpening a small ranch knife against a whetstone more out of habit than danger. The slow scrape of metal filled the silence between gusts of wind. Across the room, Ayana remained kneeling beside the fireplace with her fingertips resting lightly against the wooden floor. Feeling, listening. The old rancher glanced toward her every few moments without realizing it. He had spent 11 years alone because loneliness felt safer than loss. Yet somehow this quiet Apache girl had walked into his house during one snowstorm and disturbed every wall he had built around himself. Ayana suddenly lifted her head. Her eyes narrowed toward the north side of the ranch again. Elias noticed immediately. "You feel something?" She nodded slowly. The boy moved. Elias frowned. "You can tell that through a floorboard?" Ayana looked down at her hands before answering softly. "Not exactly." She searched for the right words. "Fear leaves movement behind." Elias leaned back slightly in his chair. Most men in town would have laughed at that answer. Called it superstition. Elias did not laugh. Maybe because grief had already taught him there were things in this world impossible to explain cleanly. Outside, thunder rolled low across the mountains. Then came another sound beneath it. Faint. Distant. Ayana stood instantly. Elias heard it a second later. A horse screaming near the barn. Both moved at once. Elias grabbed the lantern beside the door while Ayana pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders and followed him into the storm. Snow struck their faces sideways the moment the door opened. Wind ripped across the ranch yard hard enough to steal breath from a man's lungs. The lantern flame flickered wildly while Elias pushed forward toward the barn through knee-deep drifts. Inside, one of the horses kicked hard against its stall, terrified by something unseen. The animal's dark eyes rolled white beneath the lantern glow. Ayana stepped carefully closer while Elias muttered under his breath. "Easy now. Easy." But the horse only grew more agitated. Elias reached for the reins hanging nearby when Ayana touched his arm lightly. He stopped. She moved forward alone. Slowly, calm as snowfall. Her hand lifted toward the frightened animal's neck while the barn groaned around them beneath the storm. Elias watched carefully. Most horses trusted him eventually. This one looked ready to break the stall apart. Yet the moment Ayana's fingertips touched the horse's mane, the animal froze. Not from fear. Recognition. Its breathing slowed almost immediately beneath her hand. Elias stared openly now. "How did you do that?" Ayana kept her eyes on the horse. He was not afraid of the storm. Elias frowned. "Then what?" She looked toward the far corner of the barn, where darkness pooled thick between stacked hay bales. Something frightened him outside first. Elias slowly lifted the lantern higher. The shadows shifted across old tools, rope, and feed sacks. Nothing moved. Then Ayana stepped deeper into the barn before he could stop her. Snow blew through cracks in the wooden walls while her moccasins moved silently across the straw-covered floor. Suddenly she crouched beside the rear barn door and touched something near the threshold. Elias approached carefully. Small tracks. Fresh. Half buried by snow drifting under the door. He lowered the lantern closer. Child-sized. His chest tightened immediately. "The boy." Ayana nodded once. The footprints led behind the barn toward the frozen tree line north of the ranch. Elias looked back toward the storm outside. In this weather he will freeze before sunrise. Ayana stood slowly, eyes fixed toward the dark woods beyond the ranch. He was here recently. Elias rubbed one rough hand across his jaw while snow hissed against the barn roof overhead. The boy must have wandered farther than town realized. Maybe frightened, maybe lost near the river. But another thought bothered him worse. If he came this close to the ranch, Elias looked toward Ayana carefully. Then somebody else may already know. The meaning settled heavily between them. If Deputy Pike discovered the missing boy's tracks near Apache riders and Elias Boone's ranch at the same time, Black Hollow would not wait for truth before making accusations. Fear rarely did. The horse beside them shifted again softly, calmer now beneath Ayana's touch. Elias studied her face in the lantern glow. Snowflakes melted slowly against the dark strands of hair near her cheeks while her eyes remained fixed somewhere beyond the barn walls. Listening again in that strange, impossible way she had. Then she spoke quietly. "He is near water." Elias looked sharply toward her. "You know that?" She touched the barn wall lightly with her fingertips. The vibrations changed. Elias almost asked another question before stopping himself. It no longer mattered how she sensed things, only that she did. The rancher grabbed an old wool coat hanging beside the tack room and shoved it toward her. Put that on. Ayanna blinked. You were going out there? Elias slid cartridges carefully into the belt around his waist, though he carried the rifle low and peaceful. Kid is alone in a blizzard somewhere north of the river. He pulled his gloves tighter. Cannot leave him there. Ayanna studied him quietly for a second before speaking. Most men would. Elias paused near the barn door, while wine screamed outside beyond the lantern light. Most men stopped hearing each other a long time ago. For the first time since reaching the ranch, Ayanna looked at him not with curiosity or caution, but something softer. Understanding. Then another sound drifted faintly through the storm. Not thunder. Not horses. Elias barely caught it at all. But Ayanna lifted her head instantly toward the north woods, eyes wide. There, she whispered. Did you hear that? Elias listened hard against the wind. At first nothing. Then very faint beneath the storm came the weak sound of somebody crying far out near the frozen river. The crying drifted faintly through the storm like a thread ready to snap beneath the weight of the night. Elias Boone tightened his grip on the lantern while snow slashed sideways across the ranch yard hard enough to sting exposed skin. Beside him, Ayanna stood perfectly still near the barn doorway, eyes fixed toward the black tree line north of the river. She looked less like somebody listening and more like somebody remembering something the wind was trying to hide. Elias pulled his coat tighter and stepped into the storm. Stay close. Ayanna followed without a word. Snow already reached halfway up Elias's boots as they crossed the pasture. The lantern flame struggled against the wind, throwing weak gold light across fence posts buried in white drifts. Far behind them, the ranch house glowed dim and lonely against the prairie. Darkness. The kind of light a man spent years protecting because he feared losing it again. Elias kept glancing toward Ayanna while they walked. She moved differently from anyone he had ever known. Calm even in weather that made experienced ranch hands panic. Every few yards, she paused briefly, touching frozen fence rails or tree trunks with her fingertips before continuing forward, feeling vibrations through wood and earth the way other folks listen through ears. The deeper they pushed toward the river, the quieter Elias became. Not because of the cold, because memories lived out here. 11 years earlier, he had walked these same woods carrying his daughter wrapped inside blankets, while fever burned through her tiny body faster than any doctor could stop. He still remembered her weak fingers clutching his coat. Still remembered promising she would be all right even after he knew she would not. Rose had stopped hearing shortly before the sickness took her completely. Some days she smiled through silence. Other days she cried because the world looked farther away than before. Elias had never forgiven himself for failing to protect her from either. Wind roared suddenly through the pine trees, dragging him back to the present. Ayanna stopped walking beside a cluster of frozen brush near the riverbank. Elias nearly walked past before noticing her kneeling in the snow. She brushed aside powder carefully with both hands. Small footprints. Fresh. Child-sized. Leading toward the river ice. Elias crouched beside her while the lantern shook in his grip. Boy came through here. Ayanna nodded once. Then her expression tightened. Not alone. Elias lifted the lantern higher. Beside the smaller tracks sat another set. Larger boots. Adult. Deep enough to suggest somebody carrying weight or moving fast through the snow. Elias felt a cold heaviness settle into his stomach that had nothing to do with weather. Town search party? He muttered. Ayanna shook her head slowly. These tracks hid from the wind. Elias looked again and realized she was right. The larger prints hugged shadows between trees instead of open ground. Careful movement. Somebody trying not to be seen. The rancher's jaw tightened. Black Hollow held plenty of desperate men these days. Failed miners. Drifters. Men who lost farms to drought or cards. Winter made hunger dangerous. And dangerous men rarely stayed reasonable long. Then came the crying again. Closer now. Weak. Elias turned sharply toward the frozen river. Over there. He moved quickly through the trees while Ayanna followed close behind. Branches groaned overhead beneath thick ice while the lantern cast nervous light across the snow. Then Elias saw it. A small figure crouched beneath a fallen cottonwood near the riverbank, wrapped inside a torn brown coat much too thin for the weather. The boy could not have been older than 8. His face looked pale beneath frost while tiny trembling hands clutched a broken lantern against his chest. Elias dropped to one knee immediately. Easy now, son. The child jerked backward in fear at first, until Ayanna stepped into the lantern light beside Elias. The boy's frightened eyes widened. "Apache," he whispered weakly. "Not hatred. Just fear taught too young." Ayanna slowly removed her blanket and wrapped it gently around his shoulders. Her movements carried the same calm she used with frightened horses. The boy stared at her for several seconds before his breathing slowed slightly. Elias checked the child's hands quickly for warmth while speaking low and steady. "What is your name?" "Thomas." His teeth chattered hard between words. "I got lost." Elias glanced toward the river ice. "You alone?" The boy hesitated. Then tears filled his eyes again. "There was a man." Both Elias and Ayanna stiffened immediately. "What man?" Elias asked carefully. Thomas pointed weakly farther north through the trees. "He said he would help me find town." Wind rushed through the branches overhead. "Where is he now?" The boy's face crumpled slightly. "He got angry when I could not walk fast." Elias felt his chest harden instantly. He looked toward the dark woods where snow drifted endlessly between the trees. Somebody had led this child deeper into the storm instead of back toward safety. Ayanna touched the frozen ground beside the boy softly with her fingertips. Then her eyes narrowed. "Toward the darkness upstream. He is still nearby." Elias turned sharply toward her. "You sure?" She nodded once. "The ground is still moving." The rancher slowly rose to his feet while snow hissed around them. His hand rested near the rifle slung across his shoulder, though he did not raise it. He listened hard through the storm. At first only wind. Then faintly somewhere beyond the river came the sound of another branch cracking beneath heavy boots. Somebody was out there watching them. The storm seemed to hold its breath after the branch cracked somewhere beyond the frozen river. Snow drifted silently between the pine trees while Elias Boone stood motionless beside the frightened boy, one hand resting near the rifle slung low against his coat. Ayanna remained kneeling beside Thomas with her fingers lightly touching the blanket wrapped around his shoulders, calm in a way that made the darkness itself feel louder. The lantern flame trembled weakly between gusts of wind, throwing pale gold across the ice and tree trunks. Elias narrowed his eyes toward the woods. "Who was out there?" His voice carried steady through the storm. No answer came back. Only wind sliding through branches. Then another sound. Slow footsteps shifting carefully through deep snow farther upstream. Somebody moving away from them now. Not running. Watching. Elias took one step toward the trees before Ayanna suddenly grabbed his sleeve. Her touch stopped him instantly. She shook her head once. "He wants you to follow." Elias looked down at her. "You know that." Ayanna's eyes stayed fixed on the darkness. Fear moves differently than hunger. Thomas clutched the blanket tighter around himself. That man kept asking questions. Elias crouched beside him again. "What kind of questions?" The boy sniffled hard against the cold. He asked where the Apache camp was. Ayanna and Elias exchanged a brief look beneath the lantern light. Something cold settled deeper inside the rancher's chest. This was no ordinary drifter stumbling through a blizzard. Somebody had been looking for the Apache camp specifically while the town already sat ready to blame native people for anything that went wrong tonight. Elias glanced once more toward the woods where the unseen figure had disappeared. Every instinct told him to track the man immediately, but another instinct spoke louder. The child shaking beside them would not survive much longer in this cold. "We move now," Elias said firmly. "Back to the ranch." Thomas looked up weakly. "You know my ma?" "Everybody knows Martha Bell," Elias answered while lifting the boy carefully into his arms. "Woman can yell loud enough to wake cattle 3 counties away." The frightened child managed the smallest smile at that. Ayanna rose beside them while snow continued falling thicker through the trees. The walk back felt longer somehow. Wind pushed harder across the riverbank while ice cracked softly beneath drifting snow along the edges of the frozen water. Elias carried Thomas against his chest beneath the heavy coat, shielding him from the cold as much as possible. Ayanna walked slightly ahead now, eyes scanning the darkness with quiet concentration. Every few minutes she stopped briefly, listening through the earth again with those strange, impossible instincts of hers. Elias no longer questioned it. Somewhere during the night, disbelief had quietly surrendered to trust. They reached the ranch just before the storm worsened again. Lantern lights still glowed warmly through the windows while the horses inside the barn stomped nervously against the cold. Elias pushed open the front door with one shoulder and carried Thomas inside near the fire. Warmth rushed across the room immediately. The boy's pale face relaxed slightly at the heat, while Ayanna knelt beside the stove preparing hot water without being asked. She moved around the ranch house now, like somebody learning its silence instead of fearing it. Elias noticed that too. Strange how quickly loneliness adjusted once another quiet soul entered the room. Thomas stared around the house with tired eyes before focusing on the tiny boots near the fireplace shelf. "Those your kids?" The question struck the room softly, but hard enough to still the fire itself for a moment. Elias froze near the stove. Ayanna glanced toward him carefully. The old rancher stared into the flames before answering. "My daughters." Thomas shifted uncomfortably beneath the blanket. "She gone." Elias nodded once. No more words than that. Yet somehow the pain inside them filled the room heavier than thunder. Ayanna handed Thomas a warm cup carefully while the boy whispered a small thank you. Then she crossed quietly toward the shelf beside the fireplace. Elias watched her without speaking as she gently touched one finger against the tiny leather boots. "She stayed," Ayanna said softly. Elias frowned slightly. "What?" Ayanna looked toward the fire. "Some people leave completely when they die." Her eyes moved back to the boots. "Some stay where they were loved." Silence settled over the room again. But this silence felt different from before. Less empty. Elias lowered himself slowly into the chair near the fire while snow hissed against the windows outside. He had spent years refusing to speak Rose's name aloud because saying it made the loss feel new again. Yet somehow this Apache girl who heard through vibrations and silence had walked into his house and spoken about death without fear or pity, only understanding. Thomas slowly drifted asleep, wrapped beneath blankets near the fire while the storm raged harder outside. Elias stared at the flames for a long while before finally speaking quietly. "Rose used to feel music through the floorboards too." Ayanna looked toward him instantly. Elias rubbed tired hands together slowly. "After the fever took her hearing, she would sit near my chair whenever I played harmonica." His voice roughened slightly. Said she could still hear it through the wood. The room grew still enough to hear the logs settling inside the fireplace. Ayanna lowered her eyes gently. "That is because sound does not disappear." Elias gave a faint, tired smile. "No." She shook her head once. "It just finds another way to reach people." Outside, the storm howled against the ranch walls while somewhere far beyond the frozen woods an unseen man disappeared deeper into the night, carrying questions about the Apache camp and secrets no one yet understood. But inside the lonely ranch house, beside the fire and the sleeping child, something quieter had already begun changing. And if you are still here beside the fire with Elias Boone and Ayanna after all these miles through snow and silence, thank you for riding with this story tonight. By dawn, the storm had buried half the ranch beneath white silence. Snow rested thick along the fence posts and barn roof, while pale morning light spread slowly across the Wyoming valley like cold ash. Inside the ranch house, the fire had burned low during the night, leaving the room wrapped in soft orange shadows and the faint smell of cedar smoke. Thomas still slept beneath 2 wool blankets near the fireplace, curled tightly like a child trying to stay hidden from bad dreams. Elias Boone stood near the kitchen table pouring black coffee into a tin cup while exhaustion sat heavy beneath his eyes. He had not slept. Some men stopped sleeping deeply after grief hollowed them out long enough. Ayanna sat quietly beside the window, watching frost gather along the glass. Her fingertips rested lightly against the floorboards again, almost absent-minded now, like breathing. Elias noticed she did that whenever she grew thoughtful, feeling the world beneath her instead of listening to it. Outside, horses shifted softly inside the barn. Somewhere farther off, a crow called once across the frozen fields. Then Thomas stirred awake suddenly, panic flashing across his face before he remembered where he was. "Easy," Elias said calmly without turning around. "You are warm. That is already better than last night." The boy pushed himself upright slowly, blanket still wrapped around his shoulders. His eyes drifted immediately toward Ayanna, sitting near the window. Unlike most children in Black Hollow, he no longer looked afraid of her. Curious maybe, but not afraid. "Did they find my ma?" he asked quietly. Elias handed him a cup of warm water first before answering. "Not yet." Thomas lowered his gaze. "She is going to think I ran away." Elias leaned against the counter, studying the boy carefully. "Did you?" Thomas hesitated for several seconds. Then he shook his head slowly. I was trying to follow the lights near the river. Ayanna turned slightly toward him. What lights? The boy looked uncertain now. I do not know. Like lanterns moving through the trees. Elias frowned immediately. Search party. Thomas shook his head again. Too far north. Silence settled briefly across the room. Elias glanced toward Ayanna. She already looked tense. Listening again. The rancher stepped toward the window beside her and stared out across the frozen pasture. Smoke rose faintly in the far distance near Black Hollow, but something else caught his attention closer to the ridge line north of the river. Birds. A whole cluster lifting suddenly from the trees. Disturbed. Elias narrowed his eyes. Somebody is moving out there. Ayanna touched the wood beneath the window frame softly. Then she nodded once. More than one person now. Thomas looked between them nervously. Is it the man from last night? Elias did not answer immediately. His mind kept circling the same question. Why would somebody lead a child toward the Apache camp during a blizzard? Not robbery. Not accident. Something about it felt deliberate. Like bait dropped into dry grass waiting for one spark. The rancher grabbed his heavy coat from the chair beside the stove. You stay here, he told Thomas firmly. Then he looked toward Ayanna. You too. She stood immediately. No, Elias frowned. No. Ayanna stepped closer to the window. The ground feels wrong. Ground usually feels cold in winter. Not cold. She searched for words carefully. Uneasy. Elias studied her face for a second. She truly believed what she sensed. That still should have sounded impossible to him. Yet after the night before, disbelief felt harder to hold onto than faith. Thomas suddenly spoke again, quieter this time. The man kept asking if Apache people trusted strangers. Elias slowly turned back toward him. You remember anything else? Thomas swallowed nervously. He said the town would blame them anyway. The room fell silent enough to hear snow sliding from the roof outside. Elias Boone felt something old and bitter rise in his chest then. He had seen men like that before. Men who treated fear like kindling. Men who whispered one ugly idea into frightened towns until neighbors turned suspicious of each other overnight. Black Hollow already stood one bad rumor away from trouble, and somebody out there knew it. Ayanna moved toward the fireplace shelf where the tiny leather boots still rested untouched beside the faded family photograph. She stared at the picture quietly for a long moment before speaking. Your daughter trusted people too easily? Elias looked down into his coffee cup. Rose thought everybody carried kindness somewhere inside them. His voice softened slightly despite himself. Even after people disappointed her. Ayanna glanced toward him gently. Maybe she was stronger than they were. Elias almost answered before stopping. Nobody had spoken about Rose in this house for years. Not really. Most folks avoided dead children in conversation the same way they avoided broken church bells. Too painful. Too heavy. Yet somehow this Apache girl spoke about her like she still belonged inside the room, instead of buried beneath frozen Wyoming earth. Then suddenly Ayanna's expression changed. Her eyes lifted sharply toward the barn. Elias noticed immediately. What? She stepped toward the door. Horse. Elias listened hard. At first nothing. Then faintly came the sound of a horse breathing outside near the porch. Not his. Too close to the house. The rancher quietly reached for the rifle hanging beside the door while Ayanna moved nearer the window. Through the frost-covered glass, they saw a single rider sitting motionless beside the fence line beneath the pale morning snow. Deputy Warren Pike. Deputy Warren Pike sat motionless beyond the fence line while snow drifted slowly around his horse beneath the pale gray morning sky. The young deputy looked exhausted. Frost clung to the shoulders of his dark coat, and his eyes carried the hollow strain of a man who had spent the entire night chasing fear through frozen woods. Elias Boone lowered the rifle slightly, but did not set it down. Beside the window, Ayanna stood very still with one hand resting lightly against the wall as though the old ranch house itself whispered warnings only she could hear. Thomas tightened the blanket around his shoulders near the fireplace. That is him, the boy whispered nervously. Elias glanced back. The man from the river. Thomas shook his head quickly. No. The deputy. Elias exhaled slowly through his nose and stepped toward the front door. Stay inside. The cold hit hard the moment he stepped onto the porch. Snow creaked beneath his boots while Pike slowly dismounted near the gate. The deputy looked younger in daylight. Barely more than a boy trying to wear authority like a coat too heavy for his shoulders. Morning, Pike called carefully. Elias grunted. Depends who you ask. Pike glanced toward the ranch house windows, where warm firelight still glowed faintly behind the curtains. Heard you found Thomas Bell. Found him freezing near the North River. Pike nodded once, relief softening his face for the first time. Town is near tearing itself apart. Elias leaned against the porch rail slightly. That surprises you. Pike lowered his eyes briefly. Martha Bell accused the Apache traders before sunrise. Of course she did. Snow drifted silently between them for a moment before Pike spoke again, quieter now. There is something else. Elias watched him carefully. The deputy looked uncomfortable. Not frightened exactly. More like a man realizing he stepped into water deeper than expected. We found tracks north of town this morning, Pike said. Several men moving toward the Apache camp. Elias felt his jaw tighten. Your men? Pike shook his head immediately. No. These riders stayed off the roads. The deputy hesitated again before continuing. One of the tracks matched a man named Caleb Mercer. Elias straightened slightly at the name. He had not heard it spoken in years. Caleb Mercer drifted through Wyoming territories after the railroad expansion failed farther west. A smooth-talking man with polished boots and eyes too cold for smiling. Folks said Mercer could sell whiskey to preachers and trouble to anyone angry enough to listen. Mercer is here? Elias asked quietly. Pike nodded. Came through Black Hollow 2 days ago. Snow hissed softly across the fence posts. Elias already disliked where this conversation was heading. What does Mercer want with the Apache camp? Pike looked toward the woods uneasily. That is the problem. Nobody knows. Inside the ranch house, Ayanna watched the two men through the window while Thomas sat near the fire trying to warm his hands. She could not hear their words from this distance, but she did not need to. Fear carried itself through posture long before voices revealed it. Elias suddenly glanced back toward the house. His eyes met hers briefly through the frosted glass. Something passed between them in that moment. A warning perhaps, or trust. Then Pike lowered his voice even more. Mercer has been telling folks the Apache people are hiding stolen army rifles in the hills. Elias gave a tired, humorless laugh. And fools believed him. Enough of them did. Pike rubbed his frozen hands together. Last night, 3 ranchers rode north looking for proof. Elias looked sharply toward the tree line. Armed? Pike nodded slowly. Everybody is armed this time of year. Elias Boone stared out across the snow-covered valley, where smoke from Black Hollow drifted weak beneath the winter clouds. He had seen this kind of fear before. One rumor. One missing child. One stranger whispering lies into the right ears. That was all it took for decent people to forget each other's humanity. Pike finally looked toward the house. The Apache girl inside, she helped find the boy? Elias answered without hesitation. She saved his life. The deputy looked uncertain. Town is not going to understand that. Town rarely understands anything till it is too late. Pike lowered his head slightly at the truth in those words. Then Thomas suddenly appeared behind the front window, pressing both small hands against the glass. Relief crossed Pike's face instantly. Lord above. He stepped forward quickly. Martha is going to cry herself blind. Elias almost smiled at that. Almost. The deputy started toward the porch before stopping himself awkwardly. You mind if I? Elias opened the door without answering. Warmth spilled across the porch while Pike stepped inside carefully, brushing snow from his coat. Thomas immediately ran toward him. Deputy Pike. The young lawman crouched beside the boy with visible relief flooding his tired face. You gave half the town gray hair, son. Thomas looked down guiltily. Sorry. Pike ruffled his hair gently before glancing toward Ayanna, standing near the window. For a second, uncertainty flickered across his expression. Then he surprised everyone. Thank you, he said quietly. Ayanna looked almost startled by the words. Most people in Black Hollow spoke around her instead of to her. Pike noticed her confusion and repeated himself slower this time, so she could read his lips. Thank you for helping him. Ayanna gave the smallest nod in return. Elias watched the exchange silently from near the fireplace. Strange thing about kindness. Sometimes it arrived where people least expected it. Then Thomas spoke again, voice smaller now. Deputy. The man near the river said something before he left. Pike turned immediately serious. What did he say? Thomas swallowed nervously. He said Black Hollow was going to burn before spring. The room fell silent except for the crackle of firewood settling in the hearth. Outside, Cold wind moved across the Wyoming plains while somewhere beyond the snowy hills, Caleb Mercer continued setting matches inside frightened minds. The words hung inside the ranch house long after Thomas stopped speaking. Black Hollow was going to burn before spring. Outside, wind pushed fresh snow against the windows while pale daylight struggled through heavy clouds above the valley. Deputy Warren Pike stood motionless near the fireplace with his jaw tight and tired eyes fixed on the floorboards. Elias Boone leaned against the kitchen counter, silently turning the tin coffee cup between rough hands weathered by too many winters alone. And near the frost-covered window, Ayanna rested her fingertips against the wall again, listening to something beneath the room none of them could hear. Finally, Pike exhaled slowly. Mercer is stirring people up faster than I thought. Elias glanced toward him. What exactly is he telling folks? Pike rubbed one hand across his face. That Apache camps are stockpiling weapons. That ranches near the ridge will be attacked before the thaw. Elias gave a dry laugh without humor. Funny thing about frightened men. Give them one lie and they build the rest themselves. Thomas looked nervously. Between them, is there going to be a war? The room fell quiet again. Pike crouched beside the boy carefully. No one wants that. Elias stared into the fire. That has never stopped one before. The deputy looked toward him sharply, but did not argue. Outside, horses shifted in the barn while snow drifted softly from the roof edges beneath weak morning light. Pike finally straightened again. I need to get Thomas back to town. Elias nodded once. Road south is still buried. Take the creek trail instead. Pike hesitated before speaking again. You should come too. Elias frowned slightly. Why? Pike glanced toward Ayanna. Because once folks hear an Apache girl spent the night at your ranch while a child went missing, he stopped there. He did not need to finish. Elias already understood. Fear made stories grow teeth overnight. Let them talk, Elias muttered. Pike lowered his voice. You know how this town works. Elias looked toward the frosted window where endless white fields stretched beneath the Wyoming sky. That is exactly why I stopped living in it. Silence settled again. Then Ayanna suddenly lifted her hand from the wall. Her expression tightened. Elias noticed immediately. What is it? She turned slowly toward the north side of the ranch. Riders. Pike stepped toward the window quickly. At first nothing appeared except blowing snow and distant pine trees. Then shapes emerged through the white haze near the ridge trail. For horses moving slowly toward the ranch. Elias narrowed his eyes. Not town riders. Pike's face hardened slightly. Mercer. The lead rider sat tall in the saddle beneath a black wool coat dusted with snow. Even from this distance, something about Caleb Mercer looked too polished for frontier life. His posture remained relaxed while the men behind him scanned the ranch carefully like wolves studying a fence line. Elias felt Thomas tense beside the fire. That is him, the boy whispered. Pike immediately moved toward the door. Stay inside. Elias grabbed his arm before he could leave. Deputy. Pike turned. 4 men against 1 lawman in a storm. Elias shook his head once. You are not dying for pride today. Pike's jaw tightened. But he knew the truth in it. Outside, Mercer and his riders stopped near the fence line without dismounting. Snow drifted between the horses while the cold wind carried faint jingles from saddle chains and reins. The ranch suddenly felt very small beneath the wide, white Wyoming sky. Elias stepped onto the porch slowly with Pike beside him. The cold bit immediately against their faces. Mercer smiled faintly beneath the brim of his hat. Morning, Boone. Elias rested one hand against the porch rail. Depends what business rode onto my land. Mercer's smile never changed. Looking for a lost child. Pike stepped forward slightly. Child has already been found. Mercer glanced toward him lazily. Deputy Pike. Heard you were out chasing shadows all night. Pike's voice stayed firm. Thomas Bell is safe. That's so. Mercer's eyes drifted toward the ranch house windows. And where exactly was he found? Elias answered before Pike could. Near the river. Mercer nodded slowly like a man piecing together a story he already planned to twist. Interesting place for a frightened boy to wander. Especially near Apache territory. The wind hissed softly across the snow between them. Elias Boone stared at Mercer with growing dislike. Men like Mercer never raised their voices. They did not need to. Trouble followed them quietly enough. You got a reason for being here? Elias asked. Mercer leaned slightly forward in the saddle. Just making sure Black Hollow stays safe. Elias almost smiled at that. Men who say that usually means safe for themselves. One of Mercer's riders shifted irritably behind him, but Mercer only chuckled softly. Then his gaze moved toward the ranch window again where Ayanna stood barely visible behind the curtain. "You keeping unusual company these days, Boone." Pike immediately stiffened beside him. Elias did not. "Girl helped save the child." Mercer tilted his head slightly. "Did she?" The snow seemed colder suddenly. "Funny how often trouble follows Apache camps lately." Pike stepped forward now. "That is enough." Mercer looked down at the deputy almost sympathetically. "You still think this town survives on fairness, son?" His eyes returned to Elias. "Storms change people." Then Mercer gently pulled his horse around. "Be careful who you protect out here, Boone. Folks in Black Hollow are already choosing sides." The four riders slowly disappeared back into the snowfall without another word. Silence remained behind them long after the hoofbeats faded. Pike exhaled sharply beside the porch rail. "That man scares me more than outlaws." Elias watched the white horizon carefully. "Because outlaws usually tell you what they are." Inside the ranch house, Ayanna still stood near the window with one hand resting against the wall. Her expression had gone distant again. Listening. Feeling. Then she whispered softly enough that only the empty room heard her. "He does not want the town afraid." Her eyes lifted toward the snowy hills where Mercer vanished. "He wants them angry." The snow finally stopped falling near midday, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the storm itself. White drifts stretched across the Wyoming Valley untouched except for distant horse tracks leading back toward Black Hollow. Inside the ranch house, warmth from the fireplace slowly pushed away the morning cold while Thomas Bell finished the last of the stew Elias Boone had heated over the stove. The boy looked stronger now. Color had returned to his face, though fear still lingered behind his eyes whenever the wind rattled the windows. Deputy Warren Pike stood near the door tightening his gloves while preparing to escort Thomas home before nightfall returned. "Road should clear enough by sunset," Pike muttered. Elias nodded once. "Take the lower ridge trail. Less ice." Pike glanced toward Ayanna near the fireplace. She sat quietly on the floor beside the old couch with Rose's tiny leather boots resting gently in her lap. She had spent the past hour carefully cleaning melted snow and dust from the faded stitching using a small cloth and warm water from the stove. Elias noticed she handled the boots the way people touched church relics. Softly, respectfully. Pike watched her for a moment before lowering his voice toward Elias. "Town is talking already." Elias leaned against the kitchen counter without reacting. "Town always talks. This is different." Pike hesitated. "Mercer told folks the Apache girl bewitched the boy somehow." Thomas immediately looked up from the table. "That is not true." Pike sighed heavily. "I know that, son." Elias stared toward the frosted window where pale sunlight reflected across the endless snowfields outside. "Problem with lies," he muttered quietly, "is they travel faster than decent men." Thomas slid carefully from the chair and walked toward Ayanna near the fire. He looked nervous at first before kneeling beside her. "My ma says thank you means more if you look somebody in the eye when you say it." Ayanna lifted her gaze toward him. Thomas swallowed awkwardly. "Thank you for finding me." The room grew still around those simple words. Ayanna studied the boy's face quietly before giving a small nod. "You were already trying to find your way home." Thomas frowned slightly. "I was scared. So was I once." Her answer came soft enough to almost disappear beneath the crackling firewood. Elias looked toward her immediately. Until now she had spoken very little about herself. Thomas sat beside her on the floor carefully. "Since you were little?" Ayanna rested one hand lightly against the floorboards beside the fire. "Since the river fever took my hearing." Elias felt something tighten quietly in his chest. Thomas looked confused. "You remember hearing?" Ayanna's eyes drifted toward the flames. "Some things." Silence settled again. Then she touched the leather boots gently. "I remember my mother singing while she cooked." Elias lowered his gaze slowly. "What happened to her?" Ayanna hesitated. "Winter sickness." The same words. The same cold story carried across different lives beneath the same Wyoming sky. Elias Boone suddenly understood something then. Grief did not care about skin color, or language, or borders between towns and tribes. It crossed every fence humans built and sat beside every fire eventually. Pike cleared his throat softly near the door. "We should move before dark." Thomas nodded reluctantly before turning back toward Elias. "Will I see you again?" Elias gave a tired half-smile. Depends if you wander into another blizzard. The boy grinned faintly. For the first time since arriving. Then he looked toward Ayanna. You too. Ayanna blinked slightly at the question. Few people in Black Hollow ever asked if she planned to return somewhere. Thomas waited nervously. Finally, she answered softly. Maybe. Pike opened the front door, and cold air swept into the ranch house, carrying the sharp scent of snow and pine trees. Outside, the world looked brighter now beneath weak winter sunlight. But Elias noticed something troubling immediately. Fresh horse tracks crossed the lower pasture. Several riders. Recent. Pike saw them too. Those were not here earlier. Elias stepped onto the porch slowly while the deputy crouched beside the tracks. Snow still crumbled softly around the hoof prints. Less than an hour old. Pike's face darkened slightly. Mercer's men. Thomas tightened his blanket nervously. Are they coming back? Elias stared toward the southern ridge where the tracks disappeared. No, his voice lowered. They are heading toward the Apache camp. Ayanna stepped onto the porch beside him. The cold wind moved softly through her dark braids while her expression slowly changed from calm to troubled. She lowered one hand against the wooden porch rail, feeling the faint vibrations beneath it. Then her eyes widened slightly. Elias noticed immediately. What is it? She looked toward the far hills north of Black Hollow. Too many horses. Pike rose quickly from the snow. How many? Ayanna closed her eyes briefly, listening through the trembling wood beneath her fingertips. More than before. The deputy swore quietly beneath his breath. Elias Boone stared across the frozen valley where distant dark shapes now moved slowly along the ridge trail like ants crossing white earth. Riders. A lot of them. Pike grabbed the reins of his horse immediately. I have got to get back to town. Elias caught his arm before he mounted. Town is not where this ends. Pike froze. Because he knew Elias was right. Mercer did not want frightened townspeople anymore. He wanted frightened men carrying rifles. Thomas suddenly spoke from the porch behind them, voice small with fear. What if they hurt the Apache camp? Silence answered him at first. Then Ayanna looked toward the distant riders disappearing through the snow. They already decided who the enemy is, she whispered softly. Now they only need permission to become cruel. The riders moved like dark shadows across the white Wyoming hills while weak afternoon sunlight bled through the clouds above them. From the porch of the lonely ranch, Elias Boone watched the distant line of horses disappear slowly toward the northern ridge where the Apache camp rested beyond the frozen pines. Deputy Warren Pike tightened his grip on the reins beside him, unease written plainly across his young face now. Thomas Bell stood wrapped in blankets near the doorway while Ayanna remained silent beside the porch rail, fingertips pressed lightly against the old wood beneath them. The wind had changed again. Colder now. Sharper. Like the valley itself sensed something ugly moving toward it. Pike finally mounted his horse with a hard exhale. If Mercer reaches that camp before I do. He stopped speaking because he already knew the answer. Elias stepped down from the porch slowly. You are not stopping this alone. Pike looked surprised. You coming? Elias stared toward the distant ridge where the riders vanished. I've buried enough people for one lifetime. His voice lowered slightly. Not digging more graves because fools got scared. Thomas stepped forward nervously. Can I go home now? Pike glanced toward the boy and softened immediately. Yes, son. He looked toward Elias. I will drop him in town first. Elias nodded once. Then his eyes shifted toward Ayanna. You know the ridge trails better than anybody. She looked at him carefully. Snow moved softly through the loose strands of dark hair near her face, while silence stretched between them. Finally, she asked the question quietly. You would ride beside me? Elias Boone almost smiled at that. Almost. Today I would ride beside anybody trying to stop something stupid. Ayanna lowered her eyes briefly, though something warm flickered across her expression before disappearing again. Within minutes the ranch yard filled with movement. Elias saddled 2 horses beside the barn, while Pike prepared to leave with Thomas. The old rancher moved with practiced efficiency despite the stiffness in his shoulders from years of hard winters and harder memories. Ayanna approached slowly carrying the folded Apache blanket she had worn through the storm. She paused beside Elias near the stable gate. You still do not trust me completely. Elias tightened a saddle strap without looking up. I barely trust myself completely. Ayanna studied him quietly. But you came anyway. Elias finally looked toward her then. Gray eyes tired from loneliness met calm brown eyes shaped by silence. People become dangerous when nobody stands between fear and anger. The wind moved softly between them. Then Ayanna asked, "Who stood there for your daughter?" The question struck him harder than expected. Elias lowered his gaze toward the horse saddle slowly. For several seconds, only the creaking leather and distant wind spoke across the ranch yard. Finally, he answered in a voice roughened by old grief. "Nobody." Ayanna nodded once like she understood more than the words themselves. Then Thomas called nervously from Pike's horse nearby. "Deputy says we should hurry." Elias mounted first while Ayanna climbed onto the second horse with calm confidence. The rancher noticed she rode differently than most people in Black Hollow. No wasted movement. No forcing the animal. Horse and rider moved together like shared instinct. Pike tipped his hat briefly before leading Thomas south toward town. "Meet you near the ridge crossing," he called out. Elias nodded once. Then he and Ayanna rode north into the snow-covered hills. The ride toward the Apache camp carried an uneasy stillness. Snow crunched beneath hooves while pine trees stretched dark and endless along the frozen slopes. The farther they rode from Black Hollow, the more Elias noticed signs of movement across the valley. Broken branches, fresh tracks, campfire smoke too thin and scattered to belong to hunters. Mercer's riders were spreading out, looking for something, or preparing for something worse. Ayanna suddenly slowed her horse near a narrow ridge overlooking the valley below. Elias stopped beside her. "What is it?" She looked down toward the distant frozen creek winding between the trees. "Listen." Elias frowned slightly. "I do not hear anything." "Exactly." He studied the valley carefully, then realized she was right. No birds. No wind through branches. Even the horses beneath them shifted nervously. The woods had gone silent in the unnatural way animals sense danger before people did. Then faintly through the stillness came voices from below. Men arguing. Elias dismounted quickly and tied the horses behind a cluster of snow-covered pines while Ayanna moved beside him soundlessly. Together they crept toward the ridge edge overlooking the creek. 3 riders stood below near the frozen water. Mercer's men. One pointed toward tracks leading north while another argued sharply, frustration visible even from a distance. Then Caleb Mercer himself stepped into view from behind the trees. Calm as ever. Snow dusted his black coat, while his polished boots remained strangely clean despite the terrain. Elias watched carefully as Mercer unfolded a piece of paper near the creek bank. A map. The men gathered around him, while Mercer pointed farther north toward the Apache camp hidden beyond the hills. Then Elias heard the words clearly through the cold air. "Once the town sees smoke," Mercer said calmly, "they will believe whatever we tell them." Ayanna stiffened beside him immediately. Elias felt something heavy settle into his chest. Smoke. Mercer did not want stolen rifles. He wanted panic. He wanted Black Hollow terrified enough to blame Apache families before truth ever reached the valley. One of the riders looked uncertain. "What about the deputy?" Mercer smiled faintly beneath the gray winter light. "Fear always outruns lawmen." Elias Boone stared down at the men below while cold wind swept across the ridge. 11 years of isolation suddenly felt meaningless beside what was coming. Then beside him, Ayanna touched the frozen earth lightly with her fingertips and whispered softly into the silence. "More riders are coming." Elias looked up sharply toward the southern ridge beyond the trees. Dark shapes moved through the snow below. Townsmen from Black Hollow, armed, angry, and riding straight toward the Apache camp. The riders from Black Hollow moved through the snow like a dark river cutting across the white valley below. Nearly 20 men now. Ranchers, miners, shopkeepers. Faces Elias Boone recognized from church porches and cattle auctions and quiet mornings inside the general store. Men who once borrowed tools from neighbors and shared coffee beside winter fires. Now they rode with rifles across their saddles because fear had finally found something to wear. Beside Elias on the ridge, Ayanna remained perfectly still with one hand pressed against the frozen earth beneath the pines. Her eyes closed briefly while cold wind moved through the trees around them. "They are angry," she whispered softly. Elias stared down at the riders below. Angry men are usually frightened first. Down near the creek bed, Caleb Mercer folded the map slowly and slid it inside his coat while his riders mounted their horses again. Calm, patient, like a man watching dry grass wait for a spark. Elias Boone had known trouble before, but Mercer was different. Dangerous men usually carried rage openly. Mercer carried certainty. That frightened Elias more. One of Mercer's riders pointed suddenly toward the southern ridge where the Black Hollow men approached through the snow. Mercer smiled faintly beneath the gray afternoon sky. Even from this distance, Elias could see it clearly. Satisfaction. He planned this, Elias muttered quietly. Ayanna opened her eyes. Yes. Elias looked toward her. How can you be so calm? A faint sadness crossed her face then. Because I have seen this before. Wind swept softly across the ridge while distant horse hooves echoed through the frozen valley below. Ayanna kept her gaze on the approaching riders. When people stop listening, they begin searching for someone to blame. Elias felt those words settle deep inside him. Because he had done the same thing once. After Rose died, he blamed doctors, Winter, God, himself, anybody except the truth that grief sometimes arrived without permission or fairness. Down below, Mercer rode slowly toward the men from Black Hollow as though greeting old friends. Deputy Warren Pike suddenly appeared from the Southern Trail moments later, galloping hard through the snow toward the gathering riders. Elias exhaled sharply. Damn fool. Pike pulled his horse sideways between Mercer and the townsmen while snow kicked into the air around him. Even from the ridge, Elias could hear the young deputy shouting, trying to reason with frightened men carrying too much anger and too little truth. Mercer listened calmly. Then he pointed north toward the Apache camp hidden beyond the ridge. The effect spread instantly through the crowd. Elias saw it happen like wind moving through tall grass. Nervous shifting, raised voices, hands tightening around reins and rifle straps. Fear becoming permission. Pike kept arguing desperately while the riders around him grew louder. One man finally turned his horse north. Then another followed. Then 5 more. The crowd was beginning to move. Ayanna suddenly stood. We have to reach the camp first. Elias looked down toward the valley, calculations already turning inside his head. No chance beating them straight north. Ayanna pointed east toward a narrow ridge path buried between pine trees. There is another trail. Elias glanced toward the steep frozen slope. Dangerous ride. Narrow footing. One wrong step and horses would tumble 30 feet into the ravine below. He looked back toward the growing mob beneath them. Lead the way. They mounted quickly and pushed east through the trees while cold branches scraped against their coats. Snow cracked beneath the horses as they climbed the hidden ridge trail, winding sharply above the valley floor. Below them, the riders from Black Hollow spread wider now, following Mercer toward the northern hills like men sleepwalking into disaster. Elias kept glancing toward Ayanna riding ahead. She moved through the mountains with instinctive certainty despite the dangerous terrain. No hesitation. No fear. Like the land itself trusted her feet. The trail narrowed sharply near the cliffs overlooking the frozen river. One side dropped into jagged rock and snow 30 feet below. The horses breathed heavily while icy wind whipped across the ridge hard enough to steal warmth through thick wool coats. Elias noticed Ayanna suddenly slow her horse. Near a cluster of pine trees. What is it? She looked toward the western valley. Listen. Elias frowned slightly. Then he heard it too. Not shouting. Singing. Faint voices drifting upward through the cold air from somewhere beyond the ridge. Apache voices. Calm. Steady. Elias looked toward Ayanna. Your camp. She nodded slowly. They are praying for the storm dead. Elias felt something tighten quietly in his chest again. Down below, frightened men rode toward people singing prayers for the dead while believing they marched toward enemies. The unfairness of it sat heavy against the frozen silence around them. They reached the final ridge just before sunset painted the snowfields pale gold beneath the clouds. The Apache camp rested below inside a sheltered valley surrounded by pine trees and smoke from small cooking fires. Families moved quietly between tents and wagons preparing for evening. Children carried firewood. Women stirred soup over iron pots. Ordinary life. Peaceful life. Elias stared down at the valley for a long moment. Then distant movement caught his eye farther south. Mercer's riders. Closer now. And behind them came the men from Black Hollow spreading across the ridge like a storm front. Ayanna dismounted immediately. I have to warn them. Elias grabbed her wrist before she moved. She turned sharply toward him. What? Elias looked down at the approaching riders. If they see Apache scouts rushing around with rifles, Mercer wins. Iona froze, because she understood instantly. Fear only needed one wrong image now. One misunderstanding. One spark. Elias slowly released her wrist. Your people stay calm. His gray eyes fixed on the riders below. I will stop the town. Iona stared at him like she could not quite believe what he just said. One lonely rancher standing between two terrified groups with rifles and rumors already poisoning the valley. Impossible odds. But Elias Boone only looked tired now. Not afraid. Then softly, almost like a whisper carried by snow, Iona asked him something no one had asked in years. Why are you doing this? Elias looked toward the Apache camp, where children laughed softly beside the fires below. For a second his face changed beneath the fading Wyoming light. Older, sadder, honest. Because nobody stood between fear and my little girl when the town decided she was broken. Silence moved between them after that. Then Elias Boone turned his horse toward the descending ridge while the first riders from Black Hollow entered the valley below. The valley fell silent the moment Elias Boone rode down from the ridge alone. Snow crunched beneath his horse while the last light of evening stretched long shadows across the frozen ground between the Apache camp and the riders from Black Hollow. Fires flickered softly near the tents below where Apache families stood gathered in uneasy silence, watching armed townsmen descend through the snow behind Caleb Mercer. Children clung to their mothers. Old men stood near the fires without reaching for weapons. Fear moved quietly through both sides now, thick as winter smoke. Elias guided his horse straight into the open space between them and stopped. Wind drifted through the valley carrying the smell of cedar smoke and cold iron. Mercer smiled faintly from horseback several yards away. Careful, Boone, he called calmly. You are standing in the wrong place. Elias rested one gloved hand against the saddle horn. Looks to me like I am standing in the only place left. Behind Mercer, frightened townsmen shifted uneasily in their saddles. Some looked angry. Others looked uncertain now that the Apache camp stood visible before them, not as soldiers or raiders, but families beside evening fires. Deputy Warren Pike finally rode into the valley from the southern trail moments later, breathless and exhausted. Everybody stop right there. His voice cracked through the cold air, but fear already moved faster than law. One rancher near the back shouted angrily. Mercer said they stole army rifles. Another yelled. The missing boy was found near this camp. Murmurs spread instantly through the riders. Mercer stayed quiet. That was the clever part. He let frightened men finish the fire themselves. Elias Boone slowly turned his horse toward the townsmen. Thomas Bell was found freezing near the river, he said firmly. Alive because an Apache girl carried him through the storm. A few riders exchanged uncertain glances. Mercer tilted his head slightly. That what she told you? Elias looked toward him. That what the boy told all of us? Mercer smiled thinly. Children say many things. Then suddenly Thomas Bell's voice echoed across the valley. No, sir. I do not. Every head turned sharply toward the southern ridge, where Deputy Pike now rode down with the boy seated safely in front of him beneath thick blankets. Martha Bell followed close behind on horseback, tears frozen against her cheeks from hours of fear and searching. Pike stopped beside Elias while Thomas climbed down carefully into the snow. The child looked terrified standing between armed men and Apache families. But he kept walking anyway, straight toward Elias, straight toward Iona, who now stepped quietly from the edge of the Apache camp into the fading light. Murmurs spread immediately among the townsmen at the sight of her. Some gripped their reins tighter. Others lowered their eyes uncertainly. Thomas stopped beside Iona and took a shaky breath. She saved me. Silence swallowed the valley. Wind moved softly through the pines overhead, while evening snow drifted gently between the two groups. Thomas pointed toward Mercer suddenly with a trembling hand. That man lied. Mercer's smile faded almost invisibly. The boy swallowed hard before continuing. He told me if I got lost near the Apache camp, everybody would finally see who the bad people were. The valley seemed to freeze around those words. One rancher lowered his rifle immediately. Another stared openly toward Mercer in disbelief. Pike looked like somebody finally seeing the shape of a nightmare clearly for the first time. Mercer laughed softly under his breath. Boy is cold and frightened. But Martha Bell suddenly rode forward through the crowd. My son knows the difference between fear and truth. Her voice shook, but not from weakness. She climbed from her horse and wrapped Thomas tightly in her arms before turning toward the riders from Black Hollow. This girl saved my child while the rest of you searched for somebody to blame. No one answered, because deep down, every man there knew exactly what she meant. Ayanna stood quietly beside Elias Boone while the fires from the Apache camp flickered behind her against the darkening snow. She looked smaller than the crowd surrounding her, smaller than the fear, yet somehow steadier than all of it. Elias glanced toward the townsmen one last time. You rode out here thinking danger lived inside this camp. His tired gray eyes moved across their faces slowly. Truth is danger rode beside you the whole way. The silence afterward felt enormous. Caleb Mercer looked around the valley, realizing something rare and dangerous had finally happened. People were thinking again. Fear was slipping. And without fear, men like him carried no power at all. One by one, the riders from Black Hollow lowered their rifles. Nobody gave orders. Nobody shouted. The anger simply began draining out of the valley like melting snow beneath spring sunlight. Mercer studied the crowd carefully before pulling his horse around slowly. You people deserve what comes next, he muttered coldly. But nobody followed him this time. Not one rider. Mercer disappeared alone into the dark Wyoming hills while the valley behind him remained silent except for the crackling of Apache campfires and the soft winter wind. Deputy Pike finally removed his hat slowly and looked toward Elias. I should have stopped this sooner. Elias stared out across the snowy valley where frightened men now looked too ashamed to meet each other's eyes. Fear makes decent people deaf, he answered quietly. Then beside him, Ayanna gently touched the sleeve of his coat. Elias looked down at her. The firelight reflected softly in her calm brown eyes while snow drifted through the dark strands of her hair. For a long moment neither spoke. They did not need to. Somewhere beyond the valley, night settled peacefully across the Wyoming plains. And months later, when winter finally loosened its grip on Black Hollow, folks passing the lonely ranch north of town sometimes heard harmonica music drifting softly across the fields after sunset. They also noticed something else. A young Apache woman sitting quietly beside the porch rail with one hand resting against the wooden floorboards beneath her fingertips, smiling faintly as though she could hear every note perfectly. Thanks for watching this story. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Tell me in the comments what you felt about this story and what kind of stories you want to see next. See you in the next story.